Juliet Thompson, a devout Baha'i and a New York artist, was told by Abdu'l-Baha that she taught well. Frankly and lovingly, he said to her, "I have met many people who have been affected by you, Juliet. You are not eloquent, you are not fluent, but your heart teaches. You speak with an emotion, a feeling which makes people ask, what is this that she has?" In 1919, when Margaret Randall, who came to be known as Baha'u'llah, was but 13 years of age, she went to Haifa with her parents and others to see Abdu'l-Baha. Baha'u'llah has recounted some of her experiences. One night we were sitting at the table with Abdu'l-Baha. He always placed me on his left. He smiled at me and said, "Your name is Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah means light, but unless you have something within you, something back of it, there is no light." And I realized the challenge he gave me just then. Another time we were told that we could have an interview with Abdu'l-Baha, and Mother went with me when I had one. I asked him, "What can I do to serve this faith?" The master paced up and down the room. "Study, study, study." So many times the master would repeat things 3 times. That was the message for me. Always the master knew the thing that would bring fullest development into the individual's life. If it was requested, he guided the person to it. Juliet Thompson has given us a sweet picture of the master in Akka. He had sent for us that afternoon to meet Mr. Sprague and the Persian believers, and, not being ready, I put on a dress I could slip into easily. As I passed the master standing in his door, "I am afraid I am not dressed well enough," I said. He touched my arm, smiling with the utmost sweetness. "The Persian believers do not look at the dress, my child. They look at the heart." Gentleness. After Baha'u'llah's confinement in the most great prison in Akka had ended, but while he was yet residing in the town, an Egyptian merchant, Abdul Karim, afire with God's latest message, desired to visit him. He wrote for permission to go on pilgrimage. He must have been greatly surprised when the reply arrived. He might go on pilgrimage, but only after all his debts were paid. He had been in business for many years. His caravans crossed the desert with precious cargo. He had quite naturally been interested in expanding his business, but now his consuming interest was to owe no man anything. It followed that when he received a payment, instead of investing it for further gain, he paid off debt. This continued for 5 years until at last he was debt-free. His business shrank. No longer did love of wealth consume him. When all his debts were paid, he had only enough to keep his family going in his absence and to pay for deck passage on a ship bound for Haifa. Formerly, he would have traveled first class. Now, he had neither bed nor warm stateroom. Never mind, he was going to see Baha'u'llah. As he crossed the gangplank, his shawl slipped into the water. The night would be chilly, but his heart was glad and he felt alive with prayer. Baha'u'llah informed his family that he was expecting an honored guest. A carriage was sent to Haifa to pick up the merchant, but the attendant received no description of this very special guest. As the passengers disembarked, he watched them very carefully. Surely he would recognize someone so distinguished. But the passengers appeared quite ordinary, and in due time he returned to Akka with word that Baha'u'llah's visitor had not arrived. The merchant had expected to be met. He had no money left to hire a carriage. Bitterly disappointed, he seated himself on a bench, feeling forlorn and destitute. Baha'u'llah knew that his distinguished guest had arrived, even though he had not been recognized. This time he sent Abdu'l-Baha, who, in the twilight, recognized the disappointed figure huddled upon the bench. Quickly, the master introduced himself and explained what had happened. Then he asked the traveler if he would like to go to Akka that very night, or if he would prefer to wait until morning. The merchant had already spent hours in prayer in preparation for his meeting with Baha'u'llah. But now he found that bitterness had seeped into his heart. He had felt so forgotten and alone upon his arrival in Haifa. He had even begun to wonder about the very station of Baha'u'llah. For what had he given up his fortune? He was in spiritual torment. However, in the presence of this welcome and gentle man, doubts and suspicions ebbed out of his soul. Yet he felt the need of hours of prayer to feel spiritually ready to meet God's emissary. As the story is told, Abbas Effendi knew instinctively that his new friend would not wish to seek a hotel at his expense. So finding that he preferred to wait until morning for the journey to Akka, he unbuttoned the long cloak that enveloped him, seated himself beside the pilgrim, and wrapped both in its ample folds. So they passed the night praying together, lost in that ecstasy of prayer that brings realization. The next morning, they proceeded towards the prison city of Akka. At long last, the Egyptian appeared before Baha'u'llah with a glad heart, purified through 5 years of testing. May Bowles Maxwell was one of 15 fortunate pilgrims welcomed in the prison city from December 1898 to early 1899. She recorded her experiences in An Early Pilgrimage, a divine love story. In the Holy Land, whose very air was laden with the perfume of roses and orange blossoms, she found Abdu'l-Baha, whose love, wisdom, and gentleness penetrated her very soul. In Akka, the Holy Family had vacated their own rooms that the pilgrims might be comfortable. Early each morning, the Master would inquire about their happiness and health, and at night he would wish them beautiful dreams and a good rest. There, for 3 precious days and nights, they heard nothing but the mention of God. Never elsewhere had she seen such happiness or heard so much laughter. The Master wanted no tears. At one time he asked some pilgrims who were moved to tears to weep no more for his sake. Only when all were fully composed would he teach the friends. She wrote, "We had learned that to be with Abdu'l-Baha was all life, joy, and blessedness. We were to learn also that his presence is a purifying fire. The pilgrimage to the holy city is not but a crucible in which the souls are tried, where the gold is purified and the dross is consumed. It did not seem possible that anything but love could ever again animate our words and actions. Yet that very afternoon, in my room, with 2 of the believers, I spoke against a brother in the truth, finding fault with him, and giving vent to the evil in my own heart by my words. While we were still sitting together, our Master, who had been visiting the poor and sick, returned and immediately sent for my spiritual mother, Lua, who was with us. He told her that during his absence, one of his servants had spoken unkindly of another, and that it grieved his heart that the believers should not love one another, or that they should speak against any soul. Then he charged her not to speak of it, but to pray. A little later, we all went to supper, and my hard heart was unconscious of its error until, as my eyes sought the beloved face of my master, I met his gaze, so full of gentleness and compassion that I was smitten to the heart. For in some marvelous way, his eyes spoke to me. In that pure and perfect mirror, I saw my wretched self and burst into tears. He took no notice of me for a while, and everyone kindly continued with the supper, while I sat in his dear presence, washing away some of my sins in tears. After a few moments, he turned and smiled on me, and spoke my name several times as though he were calling me to him. In an instant, such sweet happiness pervaded my soul. My heart was comforted with such infinite hope that I knew he would cleanse me of all my sins. One day, Abdu'l-Baha, an interpreter, and Howard Colby Ives, at that time a Unitarian minister, were alone in a reception room. Colby Ives later wrote, Abdu'l-Baha had been speaking of some Christian doctrine, and his interpretation of the words of Christ was so different from the accepted one that I could not restrain an expression of remonstrance. I remember speaking with some heat. How is it possible to be so sure? I asked. No one can say with certainty what Jesus meant after all these centuries of misinterpretation and strife. He intimated that it was quite possible. It is indicative of my spiritual turmoil and my blindness to his station that instead of his serenity and tone of authority impressing me as warranted, it drove me to actual impatience. That I cannot believe, I exclaimed. I shall never forget the glance of outraged dignity the interpreter cast upon me. It was as though he would say, "Who are you to contradict or even to question Abdu'l-Baha?" But not so did Abdu'l-Baha look at me. How I thank God that it was not. He looked at me a long moment before he spoke. His calm, beautiful eyes searched my soul with such love and understanding that all my momentary heat evaporated. He smiled as winningly as a lover smiles upon his beloved, and the arms of his spirit seemed to embrace me as he said softly that I should try my way and he would try his.